New York Times reporter Mike Schmidt. Mike Schmidt, your paper has a story up now. We've all watched the testimony now, but you have this interesting observation here, some analysis, that the testimony could create new legal and political pressure on senior officials who have either refused to testify in the inquiry or who have not yet been called, including Mr. Pompeo, Mr. Mulvaney, and John Bolton, the president's former national security advisor. Any new reporting on any of those individuals and their posture toward the impeachment proceeding?
No, but from those group of people, especially Pompeo, you saw pushback today. You saw them trying to refute what Sondland was saying and put as much distance between him and the administration as possible. Pompeo coming out and saying in a statement that he put out on his plane that any implication that he talked to Sondland about the fact that the aid was linked to the investigations is not true. Now, we went back and looked at the transcript, and it's not entirely clear that Sondland said that exactly. What Sondland was saying is that the aid had been, basically, not the aid, but Sondland is basically saying that Pompeo knew about the statement that they were trying to get the Ukrainians to put out. He knew about another effort they were trying to do with the Ukrainian president, but sort of as much as possible today, you saw Mike Pence putting out a statement that pushed back on what Sondland said about him. And that was sort of how the administration was trying to undermine this testimony, which, as you were pointing out earlier, does rope in a lot of people in ways that we didn't have before.
I wonder your take on sort of the sweep of what the regular channel included. The regular channel was the Trump-directed, Rudy-contaminated, if you will, Pompeo green-lighting and Vice President Pence at least aware of a pressure campaign in Ukraine.
Yeah, Sondland making the argument today that why would he be the irregular channel when he was talking to the White House Chief of Staff, the Secretary of State, the top folks at the National Security Council. He's saying, look, if people were excluded from that, I'm sorry if you weren't part of the party, but we were in the channel. We were doing what the president wanted. The president asked us to do this. He said, talk to Rudy Giuliani. We were the people at the top of the administration, and we were communicating this, and everyone knew about it. It was not just me. I was not a lone actor in this.
It was notable that in the prepared opening statement, Sondland makes clear that if he'd known that Rudy Giuliani's associates were under criminal investigation in the Southern District of New York, he would not have, even at the president's direction, he seemed to testify that he would not have worked with them. What do we know about any potential for the criminal investigation into Giuliani's associates or Giuliani's foreign business and this impeachment inquiry intersecting at any point in the near future?
Well, we don't really know much, but what Sondland was trying to do and what Sondland was trying to say is essentially that I would have stopped if I knew there was criminal implications to this. And that is sort of significant because the question keeps on coming up. Why was it that Sondland did what he did? Why did he continue to play ball with Giuliani? And he tried to explain today that that was how the only way the United States and Ukraine were going to have normal relations was if they were able to satisfy and pacify Giuliani and the president, essentially trying to conduct American foreign policy around the president and his personal lawyer, and him saying, look, me trying to do that was better off than anything else.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.